This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
So a couple of people had asked about a technical problem with Alongside the Void, so that episode is like part of this series, but it's not like in the serial format. It's alongside of it. If you have trouble with that in most apps that you're on, you just remove the download and re-download it, and that should fix the glitch where it stops at like 42 minutes or something. If you have more trouble with it, just send me an email, TrueCrimeXS, and I'll get that fixed for you.
You know, I don't even know. Like, so we've tried to record about this. I'm going to do it now. I think you were still catching up on the trial. I don't like to cover these big mainstream cases, but I can't not cover a little bit of this. Did you go back and watch all of the Murdaugh trial?
I've watched it all, and I am currently probably most of the way through the defense's close.
Yeah, so there's all you've got left is the prosecution's closing argument. The defense is they get a little rambly.
Do they close again?
They rebut. So
Okay.
So the prosecution, the prosecution has a main closing there. The defense comes back, and then the prosecution rebuts some of it. And I got to say that the prosecution does a really good job in closing. The defense does not. And then the prosecution comes back, and I don't know why they do this, but they did this throughout the trial. Every time the prosecution rebutted something that the defense did, like even the most ridiculous stuff that the defense did, which some of it was ridiculous. The defense in this case had way too many cooks in the kitchen, I think, but they just hammer them. They I use the word eviscerate because they literally every point the defense tried to make, in my opinion, the prosecution has pretty much destroyed it. So we've got a verdict at this point. Like everybody knows in the world that Alex, whatever you call him.
His name is Alec.
He is he's guilty of killing Paul and Maggie Murdaugh. And I wanted to ask you, I had one main reservation from this case. I think you had one, but do you think that's an accurate verdict just based on what you've been able to look at so far?
Well, that's a loaded question. So initially I felt like you're right. We have tried to discuss this several times. I was not interested in following that trial because it grew legs and walked on its own. I mean, really. That happens from time to time. Like we had some cases that we've done a lot of episodes on that never make the airwaves because you and I will fiercely sort of debate to the point that we can't use the episodes because we get into a fight mode. And it's very adversarial for the two of us. Right, which isn't really entertaining apparently to our audience. So I wasn't going to watch the trial. When I am going to watch a trial and say something about it, I'm going to watch the entire thing, right? I don't skim through it. I am going to, take part in it to the extent that I know everything that happened from my own perspective. So I could have just as well been a juror sitting there, right? And so that takes a lot of time. And so I knew the verdict shortly after I started watching the beginning of the trial. He was found guilty. I've heard several of the jurors speak. They sound like they have good heads on their shoulders. Now, there's two different things here. there's somebody committing a crime versus somebody being found guilty, right?
Right.
And I will say that based on the totality of the evidence, I have a really hard time figuring out who else could have done it, right? I question immensely the defense strategy here.
Yeah.
I can't figure out what they were doing. I used the word farcical, and you questioned that, and I explained it, I think, pretty thoroughly. Because there's a difference between offering another option to a theory that's been put, before the jury through witnesses by your party opponent, right? But it doesn't just open up free reign, right? You can't put things out there that make normal people, especially the jurors, think, well, they must think I'm stupid if they think I'm going to believe that, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And for those of you who haven't caught up on this trial, you can. There's literally a podcast called The Trial of Alex Murdaugh. You can pull that up and it'll let you listen to it. What Meg and I were looking for here, we're covering this as it's not our main case for today. This is just our true crime news for today because we still had some questions. But as she was saying, she called the defense farcical, and I asked her to sort of explain it. And this is what I'll say about it. This is a bad defense. And I don't know if it's from too many cooks in the kitchen or they had a narrative story and it was changed by late brought evidence or what. But I've listened to the bulk of the defense. Well, actually, I've listened to all the defense twice now. And I went back through trying to figure out if your word farcical was accurate. I feel like it's a little hyperbole, but not much, because I do think you landed on the right notion. There's something going on there where they didn't go any way I personally would have gone trying to convince this jury.
They didn't go anywhere.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
What they offered was nonsense. They offered for the most part, the perspective I found that made me go, well, this is, it's ridiculous. They indicated that Paul's injury to his head, the shot that ultimately killed him, was a contact, top of the head shotgun wound.
Yeah.
When in reality, it was a close range, tangential to the shoulder, into the neck, up through the head wound. And the way that they explained it, and I watched and watched and watched again, and it's not my favorite thing. They explained that essentially the brain popped out through the same hole that the shot went into.
That was their idea. Yeah. That and these are not crappy experts on the stand. They have been paid well, and they have been asked to give an alternative theory. It's just been it's almost like a parody of a defense.
So I didn't understand. Okay, so let's say that they genuinely believe that. I would have to disagree that they're experts if they do, but they've said it on the stand. How does that help their defense?
Okay, so with these types of witnesses, this is my theory on this, and I could be wrong, because I have a genuine thing I want to talk to you about in a second that I feel like the prosecution failed on, and it bothers the crap out of me, and I think it bothered you. So when you're looking at defense experts, you have to do one of two things with them. One is you either have to rebut what the prosecution is saying and prove it's either false or there are other equally plausible alternatives. That's the first thing. But the second thing is you got to weave a story so that a jury can understand that there is another possibility that is going to bring them to reasonable doubt that is not my client or the client or the defendant being guilty of whatever it is that we're chasing here. So, and I know your question is like, how did this defense help? Okay, I could see like remnants of a defense here that might have worked at one point in time. And you asked me sort of late in the game. I think you were finishing up, and I was sort of going through my second watch because I was trying to solve a couple of things for myself on the Murdaugh case to see if I was satisfied with the verdict. And I'm with you. Like the totality of the evidence is this guy probably did it. I have some questions, and so.
Well, hold on now.
Go ahead.
The defense did not help, and there is no way any reasonable person would have thought putting that up there was helpful. Because even if they were 100% correct, there was nothing to indicate that Alec Murdaugh couldn't have done that.
No, I agree. And the crazy, you're right. Like everything they did and every alternative theory they brought up, which were bonkers, weren't actually alternative theories to Alec Murdaugh at all.
They were just arguing for the sake of arguing. And like with Dr. Reimer, she actually did the autopsy on Paul and Maggie. That is her job. She was called by the coroner of the county to perform her job. She was not being paid thousands of dollars to be there as an expert. She was performing her duty as the forensic pathologist, the medical examiner who does this stuff, right?
Correct.
And she did the autopsy. I don't understand what the defense was getting at because they were trying to.
Also their rebuttal witness. She comes back to explain herself, and she was not happy at all.
Well, they go to impugn her credibility, which is something that you do. You put people on the stand. And if it's somebody has been put on the stand that's against your client or your side of things, you seek to impeach their testimony by making it not credible, right? Because ultimately in these trials, jury trials, the jury gets to decide who they believe, right? Now, here's my point. My point is that, Dr. Reimer is how do you say your name? Dr. Reimer or Reimer?
I just was saying Reimer, but I was saying that because that's what I heard some other Southerners say.
The doctor that did the autopsies, she's performed I think it was like 5,500, and then when she came back for her rebuttal testimony, she had performed 12 more or something. And so, this very just neutral doctor who was doing her everyday job, not like grandstanding for a trial. She comes in, she gives her medical opinion, and she stands by it. And there aren't a whole lot of people, honestly, that can really argue with that. I don't think. Okay. Now, she used her tried and true technique of what she does, right, to perform these autopsies. And the defense ripped her apart. The problem was it wouldn't have mattered if she conceded to every single thing that they said. She still did nothing wrong, and it did nothing to help their defense of their client.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Even if 100% of what the defense experts, which does admittedly get farcical and like a little loony at times, even if they're 100% correct, it could still be Alec Murdaugh because they didn't do anything. Like there was a couple of pieces of evidence that came up. There was some video evidence of him, like where his voice is clearly in a place he said he wasn't. There was some evidence that came in related to the vehicles that he thought would clear him that doesn't really seem to clear him. Let me ask you this.
It doesn't undermine what he said, though. I will say that I think that the defense should have taken the time to, instead of getting a forensic pathologist and I'm not sure what the other guy's official title is. The other,
I think he's a crime scene consultant and reconstructionist. I think that's his title.
okay, well, instead of getting those two defense expert witnesses to testify, I feel like they should have gotten a genetic genealogist
Yep.
to go further on the unidentified male DNA that was found under Maggie Murdaugh's left hand. I realized as the testimony of the trial continued that there was a lot of confusion in the analysis of what that DNA finding meant. And unfortunately, the lead investigator for SLED, his name was David Owens. David Owens misunderstood what the DNA was pointing to.
Right.
And he essentially says that, and he says this during his testimony on the stand during the trial, he says that when they were trying to eliminate Alec from the circle, they had to test like his clothes and all this stuff of his. And the defense attorney says, well, what would have eliminated him? And he says, well, somebody else's DNA being there, which there is someone else's DNA under Maggie Murdaugh's left fingernails. I don't know which one. I just know that that's how it's characterized. There were 3 alleles of unidentified, unknown male DNA that excluded her husband, Alec Murdaugh, who was found guilty, her son, Paul Murdaugh, her son, Buster Murdaugh, and a whole slew of other people, except for one. And the one person that they had his DNA and they tested it, it was like, I can't remember the number, but it was more likely that it was an unknown, unidentified person than it was, I believe it was CB, right? CB Rowe?
Yeah, the groundskeeper.
So it was more likely to be an unknown, unidentified person than it was to be his DNA, even though he had those alleles. Now, David Owen says on the stand that the DNA was unidentifiable and there was only one allele, and that's not correct. There has been further information like that has come out where the DNA analyst, the way she explains it, and so that's the person who actually like got the DNA and like did the statistical analysis on it, right?
Her name is Sarah Zapata, and she's an agent with the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division.
Right, and so she did the testing on it, and she says her answers are vague, but they also gave me the impression that either it never clicked for her or perhaps it was clicking like right then for her, that like this was sort of a big deal, right? It is like a huge deal that she had unidentified male DNA under her fingernails to the extent that that DNA needs to be identified.
Yeah. So, okay, pause there for just a second. This is my one question that I have, and I think it might be yours. I'm not sure. Like, without that being identified, I would not feel comfortable, even if I was on the prosecution side. I wouldn't feel comfortable moving forward with a trial until that's identified. And it is not unidentifiable. That was a misconception by the SLED agent who was talking about it on the stand, David Owens. He and Sarah Zapata, who is also a SLED agent, which is, basically their SBI down there. The two of them, they need a translator for each other because that's the one thing that, like, look, I get it. The totality of the evidence right now looks like Alec Murdaugh did it. And as far as I'm concerned, he probably did, but not identifying that DNA, which you described a scenario to me that made perfect sense for how that DNA got there. And it explained some of the other anomalies and questions that I had.
Well, And, we've got a lot of things we have to consider here that in reality, they don't come into play when you consider a man's wife and child being killed and he spending the rest of his life in prison in the event he didn't do it. However, this was the legal system is a process, right? And this thing was going, right? I do not think, I hope that the prosecution equally misunderstood the situation.
Yeah.
Because a prosecutor who is worth their salt. Okay, now the South Carolina Attorney General did rebuttal testimony for Dr. Ken Kenzie, who was the prosecution's crime reconstructing expert, right? He did the rebuttal direct testimony.
Okay,
So
I'm just going to say this. Wait, hold on. You kind of glossed over that for a second. How big of a deal is that?
it's a huge deal. This is a gigantic deal because you've got the attorney general of the state who he was there. I mean, he wasn't at closing, but he was there for a large part of the trial. He wasn't actively participating, but on the rebuttal testimony, he did the direct for their crime scene reconstruction investigator expert, right?
And what would you call that if you had to put a title on what he was doing there? Why do you think he was there doing that?
A title on it?
Yeah. If you had to say he was, I thought he was showboating, inserting himself into a massively popular trial, and I found it to be like super lawyering.
Well, I mean, yeah, it could be obnoxious, but I try not to go there. But here's my point, though. So, you've got Creighton Waters was, I guess, the main prosecutor, right? He's an assistant. South Carolina is confusing because they have solicitors, but the main prosecutor, he seemed to be like a pretty a good attorney. I mean, he seems to be respectful, right? And actually, all the attorneys that spoke, both sides, they seemed to be okay. I mean, okay, respectable attorneys. But I brought up the attorney general being there because it's my opinion that any prosecutor worth their position in the interest of justice who completely understood the testimony for what it actually was and not what it was presented as, right? When they heard that there was unidentified male DNA under Maggie Murdaugh's fingernails, and they realized that it had the potential to be identified, that they should have said, wait a second, we need to figure out whose DNA this is and alibi them out.
Yeah, this is like, that's how big a deal this is. Like, this is a trial that went on for 6 weeks. Yeah. So it's definitely the most high profile and most sensational case to come out of South Carolina in our lifetime. And it probably won't be overshadowed. Like we've had some, what I would consider bigger issue trials down there. Dylan Roof comes to mind, but this one will not be overshadowed for a long time. And it bothered me to the point that I'm talking about it here for 20 minutes today, because that DNA, small an amount as it sounds, and those SLED agents not being able to communicate within their own agency, because that's what I think the main problem here was. And I saw the look on Sarah Zapata's face you're talking about. She was already having trouble on the stand, and I'm not knocking her, because being a good scientist, you don't necessarily have to be a great presenter. But she's the one sitting there explaining her testimony, explaining her testing, explaining her reporting, and explaining how she passed it up the chain. You could see she knew that other people within her agency did not understand what she did, and she did not understand. I don't want to say she didn't understand what she did, because that's not the case, but she did not understand how to explain it to a jury, to her bosses, to the people around her, to these lawyers asking her questions. But that DNA is the amount of DNA that gets many 5, 10, 15, 20, 25-year-old cold cases thrown out Because it's under a victim's fingernails.
That's exactly right. And I want to be clear, granted, something could come up, but I preface this entire conversation with the fact that I so far I've listened to all the testimony. The only thing I have left is like part of the defense's closing, and I guess whatever the rebuttal closing from the state is. Man, this just goes on and on and on. But my point in saying that is, I'm not making, and because this is such a infamous case, right? I'm not going off of just whatever. I listened to the testimony. I have not heard anything in the testimony that gives me any indication that there's any reason to doubt that DNA could be identified. It hasn't been identified. We know that for sure. It's been used to exclude all the known sources of DNA they gathered. And on a conceptual basis, they missed the boat. The other thing was they didn't swab Maggie for DNA. They didn't swab her phone for DNA.
Yeah, if you found this DNA on the phone as well, what was you want to say the scenario that you came up with?
There's a lot of and see, there's so much useless information. And so I don't see why they didn't hone in, but I'm thinking it's because they didn't understand. But basically there's some information about what Maggie's phone was doing.
Yeah, the access orientation, the lock, the unlock, the activity of the phone.
DNA under someone's fingernails is more than likely not touch DNA. Okay. It's not just some, random skin cells that you're finding. It very well could be touch DNA, but DNA under the fingernails, it doesn't get there the way touch DNA is transferred. It has to be, it's almost like you have to scratch or you have to have actual contact, right? There were no defensive wounds on Maggie, according to the autopsy report. But her phone does a couple of things sort of at the end before it closes and locks forever. And before whomever killed her throws it, I think it's maybe 150 yards down the road from their house, right?
Yeah, it's away from the house.
And so the things that are happening there, it made me think that somebody that she had opened her phone to call 911 or something, right? And that somebody grabbed her phone away from her and that she had tried to grab it back.
Yeah.
And that's how she got the DNA under her fingernails. Now, I heard certified expert cell phone analysts on, I think both sides, I'm not really sure, it got muddled together, say that one of the actions that Maggie's phone took was that it tried to unlock with the camera. So her camera was briefly activated, but then it was turned off. And you're trying to unlock your phone is not the same function as the camera. Somebody slid to the right or left or however you do it to bring the phone up to bring the camera up without unlocking the phone.
Right.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, it's an icon on your locked phone cover. If you look down at the bottom, it's literally the icon is the camera.
I listened to these experts testify about it and I'm going, oh my goodness, they don't know what they're talking about, right? And then there was sort of in the last part of all this rebuttal testimony, they brought up the fact that they were trying to establish when the phone was thrown out of a car and ended up in the woods where they found it 150 yards down the road or whatever. And they explored the raise to wake feature on how it works, right?
Yeah.
Which if you guys, if you have an iPhone, when you pick up the phone, it comes alive. What would you like? And then it'll unlock with your face if you have that version of the phone or whatever.
Right.
And so we hear all this testimony about it. We hear somebody who did this impromptu study on a phone. And then we hear the other side tear him apart for because he's like, well, did you record it? And anyway, one thing I never heard was if anybody checked to see if the raise to wake feature was activated on Maggie's phone, because it's actually a setting.
Yeah. I do
can
not
be
know.
turned off and on, but nobody ever addresses that. And from what I can tell, which we don't have all the data, we just have what was, entered into evidence and not sealed. But I never saw her phone raising to wake anyway. I saw orientation changes, which is completely different than a raise to wake. Okay. And the thought behind that was they were trying to show like Alec didn't throw the phone out of the car. But all this testimony, complete nonsense. Nobody ever bothers to say whether they checked to see if she had that feature activated on her phone, because you can turn it off, right?
Right. And what the idea was, what they were saying there in where the prosecution was going there, I guess, is that it was actually Alec who did that while he was dialing her phone. So there are multiple phone calls and text messages from Alec to Maggie after the phone is asleep forever, meaning they said this in the trial over and over again, but the idea was the forever lock was because they were dead at 8:50 whatever, that any activity after that was caused by another party, and they were specifically saying that it was, Alec Murdaugh. And the concept was he looked at it and then threw it out the window. But what made me stick to that DNA, what drove me crazy is, and I don't know if you noticed this, but like, do you know which hand you carry your phone in?
I carry my phone in both hands.
But I mean, if you're doing something with it to type a text message,
you have it in your left hand because you're using your right hand, which is why I really do think it's possible that that she heard Paul be shot, okay, and that she was, going to see what was happening, and that she opened her phone like she was going to do something, call 911. I'm not sure, but and then somebody took her phone from her and she grabbed it back, or tried to grab it back, and she got the DNA under her nails. Now, that's not enough of an action that it would have caused like defensive, broken nails and like things like that, right? It was just a reflex, but it was enough to get DNA under her nails. Now, there has been talk about her having a manicure that day. Her manicurist is a female. So it's not her unidentified DNA. It's a male's unidentified DNA.
Well, it would have been less interesting to me if it would have been under her right hand, because that's what you do all the things with. You shake with your right hand. You reach out and get your change with your right hand. That's if that's your dominant hand.
Well, if there were 50 unidentified DNA profiles under either hand, that would be irrelevant to me, because that just means like she don't wash her hands good. But that doesn't happen because you're not going to have 50 people's DNA under your fingernails. It is just not going to happen, right? And I get it where it seems like, oh yeah, it wasn't a big deal, and I see like how they took that path, but based on like everything I've talked about with the avalanche of DNA, and like you and I have gone through it all, like how are we going to know, as DNA advances, how are we going to know who the actual perps are? And my go-to has always been like, well, if it's under the victim's fingernails, then it's relevant, right? I've said that several times. This case has blown my mind because if that's where we stand, I'm wrong about all of it, but I don't see how that's possible because of the way I've predicted this and been accurate about the cycle that's been happening, right?
Yeah, you have been. You called this years ago.
And to me, DNA under the fingernails is like the one place you can't, well, actually, it is second, because the first place would obviously be in the event that someone who has been murdered was sexually assaulted. You want to test the any DNA in any seminal fluid found, right?
Yeah.
That would be like number one. But number two is going to be under the victim's fingernails. And a lot of times there's not, a sexual assault, and there's no type of evidence to test. And so under the fingernails becomes number one.
Yeah.
And to me, the fact that it was so blatantly disregarded, and you've got these expert witnesses, throwing cell phones across the room and then trying to make it like the gunshot wound went the exact opposite way that it did, and all this other stuff. And they didn't bring in anybody about the DNA. And this is like real live evidence that matters, right? Now,
Yep.
granted, I am completely fine with it being identified and it not being her killer. Okay?
Absolutely. But it's the identifying it that matters.
And the fact that it's not, and I'm going to say this, and it's an extreme statement, but I think I mean it. Okay? It is impossible. It should be impossible for jurors to overcome reasonable doubt when there is unidentified, and it's male in this case, DNA under a murder victim's fingernails.
Yeah.
It should be impossible. Now, I don't know that like the general public realizes how rare, how much of like not a coincidence somebody else's DNA under your fingernails is. I do realize that touch DNA is like this whole thing, but DNA under your fingernails is not the same thing as touch DNA.
Yeah.
Okay. She had neat fingernails that she got manicured.
Yep.
This is a big deal, right? The only way it would be touch DNA is if somebody touched something that she then scratched and got it under her fingernails.
Yeah, and so this is in the SLED lab reports, and I'm going to steer us away from the Murdaugh trial here in a second, but I do want to mention this part. It's SLED lab report number L21-09074. It's part of the grand jury indictments that ultimately get Alec Murdaugh in front of a judge for these charges. And it literally says on page 16 of 18, or if you're looking at, there's a master file out there somewhere. Somebody was sharing the master file. The master file, you notice, doesn't have 18 pages. It has 96. So in that instance, it's on page 31. But it says, and I'm saying this for a reason I'll get to in just a second. It says that they did her left and right, and they did Paul's left and right. Just to give you like an element of what's happening in the left and right fingernail clippings from Paul Murdaugh, the DNA profiles they developed from the DNA under his fingernails is attributable to Paul Murdaugh.
And that's it.
Right. The right fingernail clippings from Margaret Murdaugh, which, if that's her dominant hand, it's indicative of a lot of things. Guess who that DNA profile is attributable to from that development?
Margaret Murdaugh.
Correct. So
it's really the only DNA that would be under your fingernails.
Correct. So this left fingernail clipping from Margaret Murdaugh is referenced here. And this is how seriously SLED took it. So this is why I'm saying it. They were able to develop a DNA profile suitable for comparison, which is not what they said on the stand, and it's not what they said to the grand jury. I'm just saying that so that people understand
of the discrepancy. I feel that because that's exactly why I'm going, huh? When I'm hearing it. Yeah.
So they did likelihood ratios on this, and they did they calculated it using STR mixes is what they call it. They had multiple proposition sets that, they went through, and that was that they believed Maggie was contributing to the mixture under her fingernails. So the DNA profile was interpreted as having been a mixture originating from two individuals. And they had enough information from that this is what they did with it. They went and compared it to the following individuals to exclude them as contributors: Paul Murdaugh, Anthony Cook, Roger Davis, Rogan Gibson, Connor Cook, Philip Beach, Renee Beach, Robin Beach, John Murdaugh, Richard Alexander Murdaugh Jr., who is known as Buster, Richard Alexander Murdaugh, Randy Murdaugh, Miley Altman, and Morgan Dowdy, which is interesting because this is all the boat case people.
Right, but doesn't it say male?
Ultimately, they just compared it, and at that point, they go back. It doesn't say specifically it's male. It just says they ran a proposition set based on trying to exclude all of those people. So it doesn't mean they excluded them based on the DNA not matching. They could have excluded like Morgan on the basis that she's female and it's male. Robin.
Okay. I was just going to say, because I know I've seen it's male. I don't know exactly which report you're talking about, but it is somewhere that it is male.
Correct. That's in a later report. All I'm saying is the first line is a DNA profile suitable for comparison was developed.
Yeah. It absolutely is comparable, which I believe I don't know if I've said on here, but like you couldn't put it into CODIS and get back a match, but you could take whoever's DNA you wanted and compare it to it and find out whose DNA that is.
And they should have done that. That is our point, is like, because of the lack of other evidence for DNA, meaning like there was no DNA anywhere else. This
I also
DNA,
think they should have swabbed her phone and her dress. I'm just saying.
Yeah. The fact that the DNA is essentially ignored and it's not explained, it means that SLED doesn't know. And it means that the prosecutor doesn't know.
Well, and David Aaron sat on the stand and said, well, there wasn't any usable unidentified DNA. It couldn't be compared with anything. And I was like, what is he talking about, right? He said that on the stand during his cross-examination. And or maybe it was direct. I don't know who called him. But I was like, oh my, he really doesn't know. And so there's a gap in understanding here that needs to be addressed. They can do it however they want. If he had been convicted of this crime 30 years ago without the benefit of DNA testing,
this is a get out of jail free card.
He would be getting a new trial based on the DNA evidence under Maggie Murdaugh's left fingernails.
Yeah. And so, all right. Anything else you got on the Murdaugh trial right now? Because I can talk about this for hours, but it's not the best topic for me because I get really heated, and I think people interpret that as like one of. So I think people interpret it as I'm supporting Alec Murdaugh. That's not what's happening. I don't give a crap about Alex Murdaugh in this instance because he's done a lot of other things that are probably going to put him under the jail regardless. But wouldn't it be nice to know if he killed his wife and son, that he killed his wife and son? He ruled out that last piece of evidence.
There are some other contributing factors that were brought up that make me feel like it deserves a revisit. But I would say, now I'm not advocating for his innocence. I'm advocating for jurors being aware of what constitutes beyond reasonable doubt. Now, they're the finders of fact. They get to weigh the credibility of all the evidence provided to them during a trial. They get to decide, who's lying, who's telling the truth, what matters, what doesn't matter. And they have to do it in such a way that is presented to them, right? So I actually don't fault the jurors here because you've got experts on the stand saying, this didn't matter or whatever they said that made it where my ears perked up. So I don't fault them for that. But so I'm not backing Alex Murdaugh and I'm not saying his conviction was wrong. I am saying anybody sitting there in the defendant's chair, any victim who has been killed and has unidentified DNA under their fingernails, it needs to be that like so and so's DNA was under her fingernails and we know why it was there and it had nothing to do with the murder. That is how you overcome reasonable doubt in that situation, and that didn't occur.
Yeah, and this is what I'll say, and this is what a couple of people have given me some pushback on this. This is what I'll say. What if it was you sitting in the defendant's chair and that DNA under their fingernails wasn't yours?
And we know it's not Alec Murdaugh's, right?
Yep. Because they were able to develop a profile for comparison. That, like, so, you know, the idea that it's trace or touch DNA, that's not going to, this is thrown out the window. Because this is like within a couple of weeks of the murder. So this is from their primary evidence. This is from stuff that, and if it is the autopsy technicians or the EMTs or some roving deputy who reached down and like grabbed her hand when he was checking her pulse.
It's easier to identify.
Yep, kick it out then. That's fine. Don't leave it dangling there, because when you leave it dangling there, you let people like Alec Murdaugh out of jail, whether he did it or not. Do you want to leave that dangling?
I don't, and I am going to say pretty vehemently, I don't have the credentials to be an expert at this, but I've read so much stuff about it that I feel like I can say with the utmost confidence, this isn't going to be touch DNA. This isn't going to be somebody that just touched her. I would go with it's more likely it could be, if it is touch DNA, it's from her scratching something that had touch DNA on it. It's really hard to get DNA under your fingernails.
Yeah, and that's the part that bothered me. Other than that piece of evidence, like I thought the prosecution put together a masterful story and they took down a monster. That's what I thought. Other than that, I thought the defense did a very poor job defending their client. Overall, I felt like there were 2 or 3 theories they were throwing out there constantly, and they never sat down and said he couldn't have done it because of this. And I don't know if that's the defendant himself trying to steer the ship. I don't know if it's because you got some big personalities. And that's the thing on both sides of this trial. You got big personalities on the prosecution side, because I didn't care for some of the people on the prosecution side. You got some big personalities on the defense side, and I didn't care for the big personalities. It's fine if they want to get in there and have like a swinging or measuring contest or whatever it is that they're doing. I didn't care for that part of it. And honestly, I'll tell you what, at the end of it all, I was really disappointed in the defense. And I'm giving the prosecution credit because they got the conviction, in spite of the fact that like a lot of their tactics and their attitudes, I didn't care for them. I honestly felt like this trial should have been moved much further away and dealt with by attorneys who were much less connected to it. And that's one of the problems you have when you have to take down one of your own, because essentially this family is so enmeshed down there. Honestly, they should have tried it in like Atlanta, or they should have moved it to the Carolinas. These people have been so ingrained in the legal system in such a weird way for so long that it should have taken an unusual measure to try it. And I didn't, I listened to it. I was so obsessed with this case for a few weeks, and I couldn't figure out why. And at the end of it all, it's because it's just so soap opera-like or dramatic.
Yeah, it was something for sure. And you do get to see a rarity in that the defendant did take the stand.
Yeah. So we are trying to get an expert in here to talk with us about Bobby Jack Fowler. It's not going to happen on this episode. I've got 2 lined up that I'm hoping to talk to you about him. If not, some of these episodes are going to be weird. But I wanted to talk a little bit about him today because I just wanted to point out like some origin things with him. And then I want to talk a little bit about something that was tangentially related to him. So we have a case on today, other than me ranting about Alec Murdaugh, because I'm sure you're tired of me talking about the Murdaugh case. You're a big newspaper user, right? Like archival newspapers?
Yes.
I had a couple of weird things related to a Bobby Jack Fowler. Did you ever run across another Bobby Jack Fowler when you were looking for this guy that is the supposed serial killer?
I am aware that there is at least one other one, but I did not look into them.
Okay, so I just want to read an article to you because it had a bunch of court records attached to it, and it was interesting in its own right. This is the weirdest thing for me because I haven't been able to rule out that is or is not this Bobby Jack Fowler. So for people who aren't aware, Bobby Jack Fowler had other crimes attached to him. He had multiple arrests. He didn't really have any murder arrests. And quite honestly, he has 0 confirmed murders, and he's suspected of 20 murders. He is known for having one attempted murder, a couple of sexual assaults, firearms offenses, and then being a alcohol, amphetamine, and methamphetamine abuser. And I realized this morning when I was pulling all this up that I had to look up the difference between amphetamine and methamphetamine. Do you know the difference?
I would say an atom.
I was just getting ready to say, like, I looked it up, but I still don't understand it.
Well, it's like just a derivative, like one is a derivative of the other one.
Pretty much. Amphetamine was discovered in 1887, and methamphetamine was discovered in 1893, and that's where my understandable notes end on the difference in the two.
Are they not derived from the same elements?
Yes, overall they are. I was just talking about it like I had always thought amphetamine in my head, and when people said meth, I just had assumed that methamphetamine was the same as amphetamine. Like people were just shortening it. I just didn't know there was a difference in the two.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, it is different, but it's probably a little more than negligible, but it's largely very similar.
Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to bring up today is it's a weird thing about Bobby Jack Fowler that normally I wouldn't go super deep into it, but it's an appellate court ruling from a 1983 case. I don't know if it's the Bobby Jack Fowler or not, but I found it to be such an interesting piece of crime court case that I'm going to share it with you guys because I got pretty deep into hunting the name Bobby Jack Fowler because ultimately what I'm trying to get to is how does he come up in those other cases with the IPANA and some of the other cases that we're going to talk about in Oregon and Washington as we go down this path. And we had recently been talking about like different DNA stuff. We even mentioned it today with the Murdaugh stuff, and that seems to be kind of how they're like connecting them to a few cases. But we had talked about the McDonald triad or the homicidal triad. And sometimes I'll go on these like long keyword searches in these different archival places. Sometimes it's like medical journals I go looking through or law enforcement journals. In this instance, it's actually the Sioux City Journal, and that's a newspaper. You can find this on newspapers.com if you care to go looking. It's a weird appellate court ruling. This is from Sioux City Journal's December 19th, 1985, which is the Thursday edition, and it's buried on page 23 under crime is all it says at the top for Siouxland, which is what they call the local area. The headline of the article is Iowa Appeals Court upholds controversial arson ruling. This is out of Des Moines, Iowa, for the byline, and it went out on the AP Wire back in 1985. It's possible to be convicted of arson in cases where no fire was set, is the opening line. Did you know that was a thing?
I did not. I'm not surprised, but no, I did not know that.
So this is from the Iowa Court of Appeals on December 18th, 1985. They're reporting up the next day. In making the ruling, the court upheld the arson conviction of a Van Buren County man who threatened to start a blaze but didn't carry it through. The court reaffirmed the state's arson laws, which ban placing incendiary material on a building whether or not any such property is actually destroyed or damaged. So that last part is in quotes. Whether or not any such property is actually destroyed or damaged is start and end quote there. In this case, Bobby Jack Fowler had been charged with arson after a 1983 dispute with a neighbor. Court records said that Fowler threw gasoline on his neighbor and on his neighbor's house. He had a lighter in his possession and he threatened to set their house on fire. Fowler did not use the lighter and did not set anything on fire. Now, Fowler eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree arson in a plea bargain arrangement, according to court records, but he appealed it, challenging the state's arson laws. He argued it doesn't make sense to allow a conviction on arson charges in cases where there isn't any fire. His appeal claims it's unfair because it lumps together conduct which is arson with that which is, at the most, attempted arson. Well, there's a hair to split, right? He said that violated his constitutional rights to equal protection under the law. But the appeals court rejected his reasoning, saying lawmakers have wide discretion to draft criminal laws as long as the laws apply equally to all. There's a strong presumption of constitutionality of a statute. And the individual challenging it on this basis must negate every reasonable basis on which the statute might be sustained. According to the court, the legislature is given wide discretion in defining and classifying criminal offenses in Iowa. I thought this was just hilarious, and I cannot stop laughing about it, that a Bobby Jack Fowler, maybe not the Bobby Jack Fowler, ends up in like a piece of Iowa appellate court history is over whether or not you can be charged with arson even though you didn't set something on fire.
Right. Well, and I believe the law or the code, I'm not really sure what they were going by, but I'm pretty sure it says that it was that he put combustible liquid, lighter fluid, whatever it was that you said, onto his house and a neighbor's house.
Yeah.
And part of the law is that you can't put lighter fluid on things.
Correct.
It actually doesn't mention lighting them. I mean, it does talk about fire, right? But as far as he broke the law. I mean, he put the lighter fluid on the house. And so I can see where he was charged with that. I can also, I don't think of it as like equal protection so much because I'm sure they would do that to anybody, right? Yeah. It applies to everybody. I am interested to see if this is him or not.
I've been hunting and I've asked, like, he doesn't appear that much in the news. That's one of the things that makes Bobby Jack Fowler so interesting to me is prior to this sort of revelation that the RCMP believed him to be a serial killer in 2012, he doesn't really show up that much. Like, even like now, today, he gets mentioned in the news a little bit, but it's primarily in Canada, Washington, and Oregon, and it's related to like a certain two series of one being the Highway of Tears cases of serial killings. Now the other case, and I was going to ask you if you had ever heard of this. So, along with the Highway of Tears, and in order to sort of get into Bobby Jack Fowler, we have to talk about this other thing that was going on. Have you ever heard of the ghost of Highway 20?
I don't think so. It does look like he was known to be rabbiting around in North America, and in Iowa is included in the states he was known to be rabbiting around in. That's what it says.
I've seen that. I've seen that quote. It's in the National Post that quote starts. And the Oregonian relays it as well. It's something a cop said.
It's from a Lincoln County detective, Ron Benson. He quoted that with regard to Bobby Jack Fowler, that we think that was how he tried to protect himself, immediately rabbiting to another part of the country and establishing himself there. And that's him talking about I guess, his behavior after he had committed a crime. But one of the places that is uh, listed as him, because he was transient, right? I mean, he was a transient construction worker, and he was known to be in Iowa. So it's not like a real particular timeline here. And I can't seem to find where it mentions that specific crime, but I mean, it's a possibility.
Yeah, it's one of those. It doesn't talk about the arson in any of the articles I've found. He's interesting to me because he sort of goes like all over. Like they have him attached to this cold case down in South Carolina that's going to come up a little later, and one in Arizona. But he's attached to 3 cases out in Oregon that were particularly interesting to me. I just didn't know if you had, like, in your searches here, if there was a way that you can help me confirm some of these things. Like I know about the Chinook Winds Casino. This is the motel room in 1995 where he attempts to rape and kill the woman who gets out the window with a rope around her ankle and runs off. We talked about her earlier.
Right.
So they, at one point in time, they were looking for this other woman named Vicky, and Vicky is Eugene Crocker's girlfriend. She comes up in some of those articles. Have you seen her mentioned?
Yes.
So allegedly, she worked at Maxwell's over in Lincoln City, and Eugene Crocker's Bobby Jack Fowler's roommate, and she vanishes. Then they were debating if they could link him to these killings along a stretch of I-45, like in League City, Texas, which is like that's a whole different scenario down there. But I bring it up because League City, Texas, is close to where Bobby Jack Fowler was born. Now where this other thing comes into play is, and I don't know if you've ever seen this, like the overlapping territory of supposed serial predators.
Do you have a map?
Yeah, like it's sort of a map. If you look up U.S. Route 20 in Oregon, now I just sent you a link. It's the top picture on the right-hand side. It looked very similar to the Pana cases in that, like, it's sort of so U.S. Route 20. It's a major west-east cross-state highway. It's in the northern part of Oregon. So it connects U.S. Route 101 in Newport, Oregon, which is on the coast, over to the Idaho state line. It basically divides the state. It's not quite in half because the northern portion is a little smaller than the southern portion, but it like divides the state. There are a number of girls and women who disappeared or were victims of rape and murder along Highway 20 from the late 1970s into the early 1990s. Now, generally speaking, I've heard of a lot of these cases, and I wanted to sort of talk about them here because it's similar to Ipana, but it's happening down below. If you just kind of glance at these cases, 2 of these are sort of attributed to Bobby Jack Fowler, but they might not be a part of the ghosts of Highway 20. Have you heard of these sort of generally?
Honestly, it's possible.
Wait, have I stumped you? Because that never happens. This will be a first.
I believe like Melissa Sanders and Sheila Swanson. I'm pretty sure I have an idea about them.
Yeah, you've definitely looked at them with me before, just not in this context. I'd never seen them mentioned here, by the way.
I haven't ever heard of the ghost of Highway 20, and unfortunately, what that kind of tells me is that it's probably like one of those situations where you've got, like the Highway of Tears or the Jeff Davis 8 or like another lumping together of victims.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you about this. Now, we're getting a little long in the case today, so I thought all I could do is sort of introduced to you a couple of victims I don't think you've heard of. There's 3 of them in here, but I wanted to introduce another suspect here, and I want you to give me like your idea if you think he's a serial killer as we move through Bobby Jack Fowler. Now, you don't have to do all that right this second. All I want to do first is sort of tell you like the cases I want to cover, because this is one of those things where the newspaper dumps all these cases together, and I have trouble sorting them out. Some of them are very clearly like there's a suspect, but I don't always see that suspect as somebody who is the killer or whatever. So I thought I would just start with a little bit about those cases and then give you a chance to go through them. There are 3 of them. The first one is a woman named Marlene Gabrielson, and I say woman, but realize this is a 20-year-old in the 70s. So it's not like it's not a housewife. It's not an older woman. It's a very young woman, like college age. The second one is the year after that. Her name is Kay Turner. Now, she is 35 years old. And then the third one that they lump into this is a 13-year-old girl named Rashonda Pickle. So we have Marlene Gabrielson, we have Kay Turner, and then we have Rashonda Pickle. So the glaring overview of them is like this is, and I'm literally giving you like the snapshot. In 1977, Marlene Gabrielson goes to Sisters, Oregon. She's going to the rodeo with her husband. She lives in Lebanon. So Lebanon is about an hour and a half away in Lynn County, Oregon. So Lebanon is located in like far northwest Oregon. It's just like to the south and the east of Salem. And it had a real small population in 1977 of about 4,000 people. This is her first night out since she gave birth to multiple baby girls 3 months earlier. So she and her husband, they get into a disagreement, and he had wanted to go hang out with some friends. Marlene was asking him if they could go home. A guy named John Arthur Aykroyd, like Dan Aykroyd, gave her a ride, and she fell asleep. An hour into the ride, he pulls off the highway onto an old wagon road. He holds a knife to her neck, and he drags her into the woods. He rips off her jeans, cuts off her underwear, cuts off her boots with a knife, and he rapes her. She pleads to be taken home to her baby, depending on where you read. And he drives her to her mother-in-law's house in Lebanon. Marlene preserves the evidence of having been raped. She keeps the clothing that's been cut that she could grab hold of. And when she gets to her mother-in-law's house, she asks for them to call the police. She described him as a large, burly man who may have worked in the woods. And although the evidence at the time, including a rape kit they did for her and the physical marks left on her body, the police don't prosecute John Aykroyd. She does not get interviewed until much later. And she is thought to be part of Aykroyd's first. So with her, like that path would go down towards John Aykroyd. The reason I bring her up here is because I am always curious about serial killers who leave victims alive at some point. And if she's the first one and he like leaving her alive, that's interesting to me. But here's the second part that was interesting with Kay Turner. This is one of the first times I had seen this sort of play out in a way that I felt like it was had some veracity to it.
Can I just clarify really quick with Marlene Gabrielson? She was acquainted with John Arthur Aykroyd, right?
I think so.
Okay,
but,
like they were in a group of people, and he was one of the people in a group. Like this wasn't just a random guy.
I think he was kind of random to her. I think he gave her a ride, and she didn't know him that well, and he was just like sort of on the fringes of the same group.
but still known. I mean, there.
No, yes, absolutely. It's not completely random. It's just
She didn't yell out like in a bar, like, "Hey, who can take me home?" Like
right.
somebody said, "I'm not going to go. I'll take you home."
Right. I will give you. I can do a little better on her for you. I will give you something where you can hear her story and make a decision on that as we go forward. How's that sound? That you don't have to do it right now. This is for the next episode because these are the same people investigating Bobby Jack Fowler. That's why I'm down this rabbit hole at the moment. I don't know the answer to that question, but I do want to find the answer to that question out. Meaning, is she random or is she an acquaintance? Fair enough.
Well, I feel pretty confident. I mean, it didn't say she was hitchhiking, so
Right. It didn't say that either to me.
they have to be acquainted somehow, and that makes it all very, very different.
Yeah. So then we have a woman named Kay Turner. Now, what happens with her? So she's the staff resources manager in Lane County at the social services office. In the Christmas holiday, she and her husband go with their friends to Camp Sherman, Oregon, which is like a little community down in Jefferson County, Oregon, with a year-round population in 2022 of 308 people. That year, she had climbed Three Fingered Jack, which is a mountain. It's actually I say mountain, but I think it's actually a volcano, and that's the summit of the volcano, and it's in the Cascades, which is something we brought up quite a bit. She had climbed Mount Washington, which is over on the East Coast in New Hampshire. It's the highest peak in the Northeast U.S. So on Christmas Eve, she went on a run. So this is a woman who does marathons. She's 35 years old. They're from Eugene, Oregon. They are visiting Camp Sherman. She goes on a run by herself just before breakfast around 8:15 in the morning. The run that she was taking, she expected it would take her about an hour, and she was going to run along a 2-lane camp road. There was a state highway worker who lived at Camp Sherman named Thomas Hanna, and he spotted her running south, and he saw another highway worker that he recognized, who he believed was John Ackroyd. So Kay's husband, Noel, he drives through Camp Sherman looking for his wife when she didn't show back up by 10 a.m. because that was around the time she should have returned no matter what. He was worried that his wife had been kidnapped, so he calls the police and he starts organizing a search. The police originally thought that Noel had something to do with his wife's disappearance because she had had extramarital affairs with 2 different men. They end up interviewing John Ackroyd, who had gotten off of work around 6:30 a.m. Now, he had been based out of what is known as Santiam Junction, Oregon, which is in Lynn County, and he drove to Camp Sherman, which is about 25 miles from his work. And he said that he had planned on going out to hunt coyotes that day. And he even mentioned that he had seen a runner in a clearing. The police said they did not consider Ackroyd to be a suspect, even though there was a witness with Thomas Hanna having seen her. During the searches for Kay, they found multiple sets of footprints together. 2 specific sets of them seemed to be running alongside each other. One matched her Nike shoe treads, so the shoes that she was running in, and the other set was consistent with footprints of a very large man. The scene that they found and documented appeared to indicate that there had been a scuffle and that the smaller person of the 2 had been drug away by the larger person. In August of 1979, something weird happens, and Ackroyd reports that he had found Turner's remains in the woods about a half mile off the road that she had been running along. She had been kidnapped and killed. Police were surprised that Aykroyd had claimed the remains were of Kay Turner because little was found of her other than a few scraps of clothing and some scattered bones. He also said that he thought he was the last person to see her. Over time, he disclosed that he had talked with her before picking up another man named Roger Dale Beck, who was one of Aykroyd's friends and a person who lived in the Camp Sherman area that he hunted with. Because remember, he said he was out hunting coyotes. But Aykroyd said that he saw her remains about 2 months after her disappearance and didn't report it. Now, this doesn't really get the police's interest for a long time. Specifically, this is all happening that she goes missing at the end of 1978. About 8 or 9 months later, Aykroyd in August of 1979, he finds her remains or reports that he's found her remains. It doesn't get the police interest until 1990. And the police began investigating Aykroyd and collecting new information because of something that happened in 1990 that we're going to talk about in just a second. Now, Aykroyd and Beck end up indicted by a Jefferson County grand jury and arrested in 1992. In 1993, Aykroyd is convicted of the aggravated murder of Kay Turner and her rape and of shooting her. He gets a life sentence for that. Beck had bragged to his family about this murder, was also found guilty in November of 1993. Same charges in Jefferson County in a separate trial. Testimony from Beck's ex-wife, Pam Ramirez, and new forensic testing are credited with helping to prosecute the case. And Jefferson County District Attorney Bill Hanlon said that Aykroyd had been trying to get the reward for finding Turner. But he said if Aykroyd had said nothing, they never would have found her and the case would never have gone anywhere. All this comes about because 13-year-old Rashonda Pickle, who is the daughter of a woman named Linda Pickle, who had married Aykroyd in the mid-1980s, and they lived in this Santiam Junction area at Oregon 22 and off of U.S. Highway 20, where all these state highway work crews frequently lived. The area was very remote, and there were no other children Rashonda's age there. She's 13 at the time. She gets bused into school, and Aykroyd was physically and sexually abusive to her. Well, one day, Rashonda was left at home during the day, and Aykroyd decided to take the day off, and he returns home very late, and she's never seen again. There was a massive search conducted by 100 police officers from 7 counties, and they were unsuccessful in finding any leads to Rashonda's disappearance. So have you ever heard of the Rashonda Pickle case?
In passing, I have, yes.
Yeah, I think I have looked at it a little bit. The deal with her is she goes missing in July of 1990. And this detective, his name is Jim Salisbury. He stays on that case for a really long time. He actually makes these massive, I would call them scrapbooks, except they're much more organized than that. They're almost like murder books on her, except it's every lead that ever came in. It's everyone who ever talked to them. They go through over and over trying to find this little girl. Because 13 is little. That's a little girl. And it takes a while, but he compiles enough evidence that in April of 2014, Aykroyd is charged with her murder, and he pleads it out. According to Lynn County District Attorney Doug Martini, a settlement is reached with Byron Pickle, who is the victim's brother, and they place the prosecution of the murder on hold. The way that they do that is they suspend the indictment. He's charged, but he's pleading no contest, and he's agreeing not to seek parole in exchange for the prosecution not prosecuting him. Have you ever heard of a deal like that? In that type of case?
He's already in jail, right?
Right. Right. He's already in jail. He's in jail for Turner's murder. The idea was like if something were ever to come to light that like for some reason Turner's case was going to be overturned, then they would suddenly pop up and prosecute him for this.
Right. I feel like she was never found, right? Not that I've seen it.
Rashonda's never found.
It was, I mean, yeah, they say they reached a settlement. I don't really know what that means, but I guess he was her closest remaining family member or the one that took an interest. I don't know. You know, they did charge him. They probably didn't have enough evidence to convict him. Well, I mean, in this type of case, it just would have went on anything, right?
Yeah.
If somebody hadn't pushed, whether it was the detective or the brother or whatever. And so they got some resolution here. It doesn't seem to be much of a question of the fact that he did it, right? At least, I'm not talking about in a judicial setting, but just the other circumstances of the case. It seems like more than likely he would have been responsible for her disappearance, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I have heard of different things. It usually does encompass other circumstances, like they're already spending the rest of their life in jail for something else, or something to that effect, where I don't think that they would compromise on a situation otherwise, right? I mean, if you're
Yeah,
gonna do
I
it,
agree
you've
with
got to
you.
do
Yeah.
it. If not, not. But it's just a way to kind of, I mean, it made her matter, right? Which is good. I mean, it's good that she matters. It's unfortunate that they weren't able to, bring the case full circle, find her, somehow entice him to tell what he did with her or whatever, right?
Yeah. I remember this case because of one sentence. Somewhere along the way, in some piece of documentary, whatever. I don't know if I heard it on an audio piece or if I heard like news or podcast or something, or if I heard it on I don't know where exactly I heard it, but it was he knew her weight and her bra size, but he couldn't remember her birthday, his stepdaughter. And that always like stood out to me.
It's really weird.
Yeah, like who does that? He's also one of those guys that sort of started me thinking along the theory that guilty people gain weight in prison and innocent people lose it. It's not scientific and it doesn't hold up. But
No kidding.
but have you ever seen a
Hey,
picture of him?
there's a case study for you right there.
That guy?
Did you send it to me?
Hold on, I'm sending you one.
No, I'm talking about the hypothesis that guilty people gain weight and innocent people lose weight. The problem with that is like a lot of times guilt or innocence can be dubious.
Oh, I had all these theories about it. Like when I started going down that path, I would look at canteen records of like what people were buying and how they were doing it, and I just felt like manipulative personalities were eating all the honey buns. I know that sounds terrible, but like
Dude,
that's
if I was in jail, I'd be eating all the honey buns. I mean, what would it matter?
anyways. So that's where we're leaving off. We're coming back, and
That's an interesting theory, though.
it's
Very
just a
interesting.
theory, yeah.
I hear you.
But we're going to come back. Okay, so where we're going next is we're going to kind of parallel this guy, John Aykroyd, with Bobby Jack Fowler because they're operating in sort of the same time, very different across the board predators. Now, Fowler does a couple of he does a couple of crazy things in the course of the story. If all the stuff that they attribute to him is accurate. But John Aykroyd does equally interesting nonsense. And I say this because John Aykroyd, he has essentially hurt people close to them. He's taken his girlfriend's daughter, and he has also apparently enlisted an accomplice, which are all the things that, like, if you we're teaching a serial killer class. You never do those things. And he does all of them. But he almost gets away with a lot of his bullshit.
Well, I'm under the impression, again, I don't know that it's accurate, but I'm under the impression that more than likely I don't think that Beck and Aykroyd killed Kay Turner together.
I want your opinion on that. You do not have to give it right this second. You have a minute to look all that up.
Well, I'm just saying, like, I find that, like you said, like if you were teaching a like what not to do as a serial killer, like don't have an accomplice, right?
Yeah.
And granted, it doesn't seem like Aykroyd confessed. Now he did quote find end quote her body, and he was sure that like the remains that shouldn't otherwise be identified were this particular person, right? But Beck, he actually Roger Dale Beck, he actually like had confessed to people.
He confessed to his own family. His own family ends up like in a position where they're going to have to testify against him.
Right. And so to me, like, I mean, it's interesting, right? It's a weird dynamic there. But clearly he had something to do with it, or he had guilty knowledge of it or something because of just sort of how it played out. It's really strange, though, for a perp to help law enforcement find a body of their victim.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff that's going to come up as we kind of move forward on this about Roger Dale Beck as well. He has like a couple of weird tidbits going on in his life, so we're gonna talk a little bit more about him when we talk about John Aykroyd. But I've always been curious, like what you think of, like it's almost like a roving band of like idiot serial killers are getting away with things. That like I know they're not going around together. But like, how is it like, I want to talk about like some of the ways this is, I don't know, like a problem for law enforcement, a problem for the courts. And how have we gotten over this in 2023?
Yeah, well, plea deals. Well, if you look, I mean, I think he was actually convicted. I think he was convicted for Kay Turner. I don't know that he actually committed that. But if you think about it, so Marlene Gabrielson, I feel like was a friend, acquaintance situation. So that's like an X on the serial killer chart, right? Not a serial killer, but she didn't die. She was sexually assaulted. Kay Turner, there's some weird things happening there with his accomplice. And then, like, of course, his stepdaughter. That's how far we've gotten so far. And to me, in the terms I think of a serial killer, Kay Turner might be getting him there if he actually was involved and did it. Beyond just having, fueling a friend. I don't really know how to put that, but the acquaintance and the stepdaughter, the female acquaintance and the stepdaughter, to me, that's just we're leaning more towards an asshole.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. That's what I thought when I read it. So
because he's picking on people that he can.
Well, let me ask you this. From what you know about Bobby Jack Fowler so far, and this little tiny bit that I've said about John Aykroyd, what do you think the likelihood that they would commit an almost identical crime are?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So they're very different personalities. They're doing very different things.
I see what you're saying. I feel like in the event that they committed similar crimes, and you mean they're similar beyond just like murder or sexual assault, right?
Yeah, it's very similar, right. like from start to finish.
Just from not knowing, I would say that it would show me that they're both just assholes.
Interesting. I was wondering if
I don't
that
know
might be
which cases you're talking about, but like I feel like an asshole is an asshole is an asshole, and you could see a lot of similarities in the things that assholes do. And you're going to find it to be like picking on somebody smaller than them. Usually, if it's a male, they'll be picking on a female or a child. It will be some sort of demeaning, degrading, bullying type of activity. It's just typical asshole behavior, right?
Yeah.
And so I do think two really different personalities exhibiting the same types of activities towards who ultimately become their victims. I think now that doesn't mean that they're not serial killers, right? It just means that, like, from what I have right this second and what you've said, that is a link that could put them committing very similar crimes without being serial killers. They're just both assholes. Yeah, I don't know. I think some people just give up and they go for infamy. I don't know.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
My kind of nonsense, your kind of charm, our kind of fumbling around in the dark. I'm kind of wondering what you're trying to see, and you're kind of thinking that it's up to me. It's all we know for one night more, and so we go until the morning. Your kind of courage is my kind of fear.